All right, let's go ahead and get started. So, just real quick to kind of go over what we have left over the remainder of the semester. So today, we're going to finish a couple of quick things out of chapter 15 up here, obviously on the screen. After that, then we're going to jump into chapter 18 deal structure material. After we finish all of that, then we'll do quizzes 5 and 6 simultaneously, and then I'll finish it up for today. Next week, we've got a couple of case studies that I'll be giving you in class to work on, okay? And those each are worth, well, actually, you only have to do one of the two. And those are worth 5% of your total grade. Then after that, we've got an incredible guest speaker, Steve Palmos. I don't know whether you took a look at the website or not. Steve is an amazing guy. He serves on the NSU Board of Trustees, owns and operates, I don't know how many different real estate properties all across Florida and other parts of the country. Made his millions in credit card services back some 30 years ago. Wonderful guy. So he's going to come in and talk to us for about an hour. And he's also agreed to stay over during the lunchtime period and do a quick, like maybe pizza lunch and that sort of thing. So those of you that want to kind of hang out and talk to him, a few other sort of questions and so forth. So sort of look forward to that. Then the following week we'll have another guest speaker to be determined. Then we'll have test number 2 that will potentially then replace quizzes 4, 5, and 6 if need be. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the presentations that will take place on March the 2nd. And then March the 2nd will be the final day of class with your quick little spreadsheet presentations for 5%. And then for those of you that want to replace either test 1 or test 2, then you can take the optional final exam. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Yes? Yes. Okay. All right. So let's sort of finish up with this last little bit of material. So for those of you that have been in the real estate finance class, you probably have already seen a version of this. But we've modified it a little bit to deal with sort of after-tax issues. So this is a simple little formula to calculate what we refer to as the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC. And what this is, WACC, yes, weighted average cost of capital. What it is for a firm that's investing in real estate, typically they're going to have a couple of different sources of capital. They're going to have the equity that they invest, and then they're going to have the debt that they borrow. Okay. Now, that's the most simple, traditional sort of deal structure that you're probably going to have. However, you could have multiple sources of debt. You could have multiple equity sources, and then we just kind of expand this sort of little model out. But for our purposes, we're keeping it relatively straightforward, just debt and equity. Now the piece that we're adding that's a little bit new is to deal with taxes, okay? Since this course, we deal a little bit with some of the tax calculations, we want to be able to calculate this weighted average cost of capital on an after-tax basis as well as on a before-tax basis. Now, what this number actually is giving us is from an individual's perspective or from the firm's perspective, what is their true cost of borrowing and cost of equity combined? And so this number, as a general rule, is usually the minimum number for their hurdle rate that we've talked about quite a bit. When we talk about investors' hurdle rate, and we say, okay, Maybe they've got a hurdle rate of 15%. They need to get a rate of return greater than 15%. Well, what we're sort of saying is that hurdle rate is going to be determined by this weighted average cost of capital. So whatever this number comes out to be, either on a before tax or after tax basis, depending on how they set their hurdle rates, they could say our before tax hurdle rate is maybe 15%, after tax it might be 12%, okay? Just depending on, once again, their own specific needs. But what we're gonna find is that it would not make any sense to set your hurdle rate below your weighted average cost of capital. That would not make any sense. You follow me on that? Because you want to get a rate of return that's going to be higher on your projects than what your cost of capital is. Okay? Simple? Okay. So let's put some numbers in here. Okay. So let's just sort of start out and kind of just throw some numbers up here. So one of the things that we have to determine kind of going in is what is going to be our loan to value ratio. Okay? How much are we actually going to borrow from the lender versus how much are we going to put in terms of our equity. So give me a percentage of a loan to value.
75%.
75%. All right. So we just want to plop that in here. 75% loan to value, which means if we put in 75% debt, how much we put in equity? 25. Okay. And we'll do the same thing down here. Okay. So that is our capital, what we would call our capital structure. Okay. Those of you that have taken any sort of finance classes, you've heard, you know, when you talk about the company's capital structure, it's where is their money coming from, okay? In this case, we're saying 75% of our capital structure is coming from debt, the other 25% is coming from equity, okay? Pretty straightforward, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, give me a cost of debt.
10%.
Okay, 10%. Whoops, whoa, what happened there? Okay, 10%, that's our cost of debt. And that's going to be, let's say, on a before tax basis. All right? So in this case, we need to know what our tax rate is. All right, well, the normal tax rate that we typically use is 28%. So we can either put that as 0.28 or 28%, either way. All right? So what we're going to have to do in this calculation is multiply the cost of debt times 1 minus the tax rate. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Because what that's going to do is it's going to give us an after-tax cost of debt. All right? So in doing that, kind of come down here, that's not going to change the 75%, but what it is going to change is, so if you say 10% times 1 minus 28%, then it's going to give you 7.2. Or 0.72, but 7.2%. Okay? Everybody do that? All right. Now, go over here on the equity side. And in this particular problem, let's say that we already, well, actually we can do this a couple of different ways. Let's say that we already know what our after-tax return on equity is based upon whatever investment it is. We've actually already calculated it. So let's just say that our after-tax return on equity is 15%. Well, be consistent, I guess I should put it as a percent. Okay? All right, so let's multiply those out and see what we end up with.
What was the 15%?
Our after-tax return on equity. Okay? So this is going to give us 5.4% on that side of the equation. Over here. going to give us 3.75%. Okay? Now we're going to add those two together. So 5.4 plus 3.75 would give us 9.15% as our overall after-tax cost of capital. Okay? Everybody cool with that? Yes or no? Yep.
Just so I can see it in my head, instead of 10%, can you do 20%?
On which one?
The cost of debt, or the rate at 20%.
So what you would do is just simply take 20% times 0.72.
Okay, so you take 72% of the percent.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So now down here, on the before tax, our cost of debt is still going to be 10%. And we're going to leave it at 10% because this is on the before tax basis, so we don't have to adjust it. Okay? Is the point. All right? So this, we just do the simple math, and we get 7.5%. Okay? Over on this side, however, we do have to make an adjustment because what we've got is an after-tax return on equity, and we need to divide that by 1 minus the tax rate, or divide it by 0.72, okay, in order to get...
Wait, so that is the BTROE is what's next to it? It's not like BTROE times ATROE?
No, no.
Okay.
In this case, in order to get that, I'm sorry, I'm going to put it like this, equal. Okay? So in this case, 15% divided by 0.72 would mean, on this side, it's going to be 25% times basically 20.83% is our before tax return on equity. Okay? So in that case, 5.21%, okay, plus the 7.5, or 12.71%. Okay. Now, based on what I was just talking about a couple of minutes ago, if we said that this particular firm sets their hurdle rate at 15% before tax, all right? We're saying that their cost of capital on a before tax basis is 12.71, so they're leaving themselves a little bit of a cushion there, and that additional cushion would in essence be additional profit. Does that make sense? If they did achieve their 15% hurdle rate. Now, just to see if you're really clued in as to what's going on there, so assume that they did receive a 15% hurdle rate. Where would that excess go, that excess return go?
Distribution?
In terms of this formula, where would it go?
In their profit.
No, but where would it go in the formula?
Return.
Okay, return on what?
On equity.
On equity, okay? So in other words, let's just sort of work this out. This is sort of to illustrate what I'm talking about. So what we're saying is if they were to actually achieve a 15% hurdle rate or overall rate of return on a before tax basis for the project, nothing is going to change on the debt side. That's still going to be 7.5%, in other words, what we've got there. Does that make sense? So what is going to change is over here, if we sort of subtract that out, then that means this is going to be 7.5, so we've got to make an adjustment here because right now it's only 5.21. All right? So what you're going to do is simply take that 7.5%, divide it by the percent equity of 25%, okay, then that means that the actual before tax return on equity would jump from 20%, 20.83% before tax return on equity to 30%.
How did you get to the 7.5 again?
The 7.5 is 15% minus 7.5% gives us 7.5%.
Why are we minus 7.5%?
Okay.
Because there was the before.
We're going back
Just,
to the.
just the order of operations, we're going backwards.
Got it.
So, in other words, if we know this, and we know this, then this minus this has to be this,
Gotcha.
okay?
The 15 that we know is what we want to, that's our.
That would be our hurdle rate, that's what we are now actually gonna be receiving on this project.
Okay.
That's our actual rate of return, okay? And so from that, if we know that our debt piece is 7.5% on a before tax basis, then we know that the remainder is 7.5%, which would be the equity, divided by the actual percent of equity, would then give us our new or revised before tax return on equity of 30%. So in other words, we have managed to raise, or we are getting, in other words, let me put it in just another simple context. Our investors were demanding, requiring that we get a 20.83% rate of return on their equity that they would invest. But we have done better than that. We are actually giving them, on a before tax basis, 30%. Okay? Make sense?
Scroll back up.
The last formula that the last thing that you did was what we did last semester.
Yeah.
That was, and so we're just bringing all of that back to figure out how much
Exactly.
it is. Gotcha.
Okay? All right. Any questions?
Just-
You said that the part that we are above what their hurdle rate, that you call it,
The hurdle rate for the project
It's 15%.
15%, and that's what we're receiving, let's
for the
say,
entire project.
for the entire project.
But the
But we only need to receive, in order to cover our cost of capital, 12.71,
Okay.
okay? But what we're trying to illustrate here is debt is a fixed cost, okay? In other words, whenever you go get a bank loan, that is not gonna vary depending on how successful or unsuccessful the project is.
Yeah.
What varies is the amount that you're gonna be able to throw back to your investors,
They're not
okay?
able to earn with the project.
Right. And so all we're trying to demonstrate here is simply that by generating a higher overall rate of return for the project than the weighted average cost of capital, then we are able to give our investors, well, our investors were only expecting or demanding the 20.83 on a before tax return on equity basis, we're actually able to give them a 30% overall rate of return.
And you say you were able to do that, so you just wrote that number in 30%.
No, that's what we calculated.
Okay.
So that's why company normally buy back and increase dividend. You know what I mean?
This would be, yeah, an example of a dividend. Okay?
In the first example, the first thing solves, the overall cost of capital. So capital basically costs 9.15
On an after-tax
on
basis,
an
yes.
after-tax basis. So the second example covers, the need to cover, the 12.71 is what we need to cover that after-tax cash.
Well, no, this is simply, on a before-tax basis, what do we need to generate?
Okay, generate income in order
Because
to
here's
cover
what,
that.
here's what happens.
Okay.
Most real estate projects, whenever you're looking at the returns, many of them are gonna be on a before-tax basis, because you don't know what maybe the after-tax or the actual tax rate that's going to be appropriate to each individual investor. Like, think of it like this. Let's say that we've got all of us collectively own a piece of real estate. And that piece of real estate, you know, is throwing off however many dollars it's throwing off, and then I'm going to give you equal shares of money. Chances are, everybody in this room is going to be in a slightly different tax bracket. Okay? And so, calculating what your specific after-tax rate of return would be, I would have to know every bit of information about you with respect to what other sources of income that you have, what other potential projects that you own, all of that in order to be able to provide you with an after-tax rate of return that's accurate, okay? So that is why in most instances, whenever we're looking at the rates of return for real estate projects, we typically are looking at the before-tax rate of return just to sort of put everything on kind of an equal standing.
Okay.
Does that make sense? All right. Okay, any other questions? Yep.
I'm dividing 7.5 by 25%, I'm getting 30 in itself, but I'm adding 7.5 to the left, and it's coming out to be 37.5.
No. Okay. All right. What we're saying is this 12.71 is the actual required weighted average cost of capital on a before-tax basis. Okay. But we're not just getting what's required. We're getting something more than what's required on this particular project. And we are getting the 15%. Okay? And so if that is the case, the debt side of the equation stays the same. We don't change it because it is strictly a fixed cost of debt. So what does change is the equity side. Well, right now, the equity side, the one piece that doesn't change on the equity side is the amount that we've contributed, okay, to the project, 25%. So the only thing that's really going to be changing is what is the actual return on that equity. All right, so what we do down here is we're just simply saying, okay, we take the 15%, we subtract out the 7.5% on the debt side, then that is going to leave us with 7.5% on the equity side, which is this number right here.
Okay.
Then what we're saying is if this whole equation is 7.5% and we're keeping our equity fixed at the 25%, then we're simply taking the 7.5 divided by the 25, and that's going to give us the before-tax return on equity of 30%. Okay.
Can you, I hate to keep going back with this, I'm not catching this. How did you get the number 12.71 again?
Okay.
Not the whole thing, but just.
You're taking 7.5
Okay.
plus 5.21.
Okay. Just add those together.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So what
The
you,
debt side and the equity side.
you called the 20.83%, that's a,
That is your before-tax return on equity, period.
cool. Now the after-tax return on equity, if you scroll up to the top, the way that you've got that number is it's provided as the hurdle rate?
No, that is simply provided to you as this was what the after-tax return on equity was.
So then both being 15 is coincidental?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay, good. Let's move on. All right. Okay. In my opinion, the material that we're about to cover is probably the most important piece of this course and understanding kind of real estate investing. And we refer to it as deal structure. And what it boils down to is, in many instances, you're going to have, as a developer, as an investor, more than one partner or more than one investor, okay? And it may be a simple deal structure, which is simply you as the developer and a silent partner equity investor that puts up the money, okay? There are an awful lot of people out there that don't know anything at all about investing in real estate or developing real estate, but they happen to have a big pocket of money, okay, that they got from whether it was inheritance or they got it from playing pro sports or they got it from, you know, who knows what, okay? They have money, they want to use that money and invest it into something, okay? So one of the things that typically happens is those folks will typically get partnered up with someone who actually does have the background and experience to actually do the development deal, okay? To actually get the project, you know, started, do the market analysis, do the financial feasibility, get the financing, you know, ultimately get the entitlements, get the project built, get it occupied, and then get it stabilized and then potentially sell it off, okay? But the equity partner, in many cases, is just providing the money, the developer is providing the expertise. Now, that's setting the stage for why this whole deal structure thing is important. In many instances, the developer will put in a very small percentage, dollar-wise, of what the project may actually cost. Whereas this partner may put in, you know, the lion's share of that money. It could very well be the developer puts in 5% and the partner puts in 95%, okay? Now the question is, should they be basically compensated the same, okay? In terms of the rate of return that's being generated off of the project. That if, for example, if I'm the developer and I'm putting in 5% and my partner, my silent partner is putting in 95% of the cash flow, you know, does it make sense that whenever the project, we get it sort of up and running or we end up selling it, that I only get 5% of the income and I only get 5% of the proceeds? Well, I think my investor partner would love that. I would hate that as the developer because it's like I did all the work. All they did was provide the money. There are tons of people out there that can provide the money, very few that can actually do the work and actually get the project done. Does that make sense? So there's value in having those skill sets to get the project done, all right? Now the question is, you know, how could and should that deal structure be set up, and what does it actually mean? The way I like to explain deal structure is about who gets paid, when they get paid, how much they get paid, you know, under what conditions they get paid, you know, are they being paid off of operating income, or are they being paid off of the resale of the project? And so all of those sort of questions are the questions that really need to be answered up front before you even engage that partner. Because any of you that have ever been involved in something that involves a partner in terms of an investment, if you don't set those ground rules up front before you begin, you're going to have an absolute unmitigated nightmare whenever it comes to the actual operation and the sale of the property. Does that make sense? Because then they're going to say, well, I thought you were going to get, I thought I was going to get, I thought, you know, you need to spell all this stuff out up front, okay? And make it very, very clear who gets what, when they get it, how much they're putting in, how much they're taking out, when they're taking it out. All that needs to be identified, okay? Is everybody clear with that? Yep?
Does the liability fall both on the equity partner and the developer, or is it just the developer because they built the structure?
Once again, totally depends on the deal structure. And this is the part where you talk about the creativity is boundless. It is. It's boundless. Okay? Now, both sides are clearly going to want to try, in a perfect capitalistic environment, take advantage of each other. Okay? Simply because you know, it's going to be, I'm gonna get the most I can get, they wanna get the most they can get, okay? The question is, you know, who can effectively negotiate a deal that's appropriate for both parties that they can get along with and hopefully, you know, be comfortable with. But, you know, in the event of a downside, it could be that both sides suffer equally, could be that one side suffers more than the other. It totally depends. Okay, so let's do this. I actually sent you a copy of this spreadsheet. You can pull it up. You don't have to. I've actually printed out a copy of it for you and put it in front of you. So don't feel like you absolutely have to print it out. All right. Let's sort of walk through this and what we've got. What we're looking at is just this one pager that obviously has the same exact numbers as we got up here. And we're just going to kind of walk through this one, and then after we kind of explained it, then we'll kind of go in and start changing some things. All right, so for this particular project, we bought it for $1 million, and then we're planning on having a 5-year holding period, selling it at the end of year 5 for $1.1 million, okay? That's pretty straightforward, yes? All right, then we move down the page, and we say, okay, let's take the first little pieces of our deal structure, and we say, all right, even though we've got this investor partner, we're still going to get a bank loan on this, okay? You know, just because you have an investor partner with a lot of money doesn't mean they want to put up all their money as, you know, cash in the deal. You know, you're still going to want basically to probably get a bank loan because bank loans are cheap relative to the dollar amount that you're going to probably want to have to pay back to your investor partner. Does that make sense? That cost of capital thing, okay? So in this case, we're going to borrow 80% loan to value, and then our interest rate on the debt is going to be 5%, all right? So that means, by default, if we're putting in 80% loan to value, then the amount of equity we need on the project is 20%, okay? Everybody cool with that? Okay? Now, this is where the departure point of the new stuff begins to kind of come into play. Now we're saying, of that equity, that's why I've indented this, of that equity, what percent is coming from the developer partner versus the investor partner? And I'm defining the developer partner as the one that's doing the work, getting the project built, and so forth, so on. And I'm defining the investor partner as pretty much just a money person, okay? All they're doing is providing this cash, okay? Everybody cool so far? Yes, no, possibly could be. All right, so we're going to come down in a few minutes here just to the NOI, the debt service, that sort of thing. But before we do that, I just want us to do some calculations so that you kind of understand what's really going on here. Grab a marker. Go over here. Most of you probably see me from over here. All right. So of the original $1 million, just to make sure we are all on the same page, of the original $1 million, we are borrowing $800,000 in debt. Yes? Which means that we have to put in $200,000 of equity. Yes? Okay, everybody's still completely with me? Okay, now, of that $200,000 equity, we are saying that the developer is putting in 15% of that. Just to make sure I don't screw anything up. So 200,000
30,000
times 15%. So 30,000 of that is coming from the developer. The remaining 170,000 is coming from the investor. Okay? Yep.
Who's on the hook for the debt?
Both.
Both are.
But you could, in your partnership agreement, You could simply say that only one or the other is on the hook.
Or a percentage.
Right, well, in this case, they would be proportionally liable, okay? Which
Could be that-
we're getting to.
Could be that you couldn't get a loan without the partner, right? So the bank may want.
There's several, once again, as I said earlier, there are an infinite number of ways to structure this. It's all a question of what you and your investor partner can negotiate, okay? What I'm trying to say is this is the simplest approach, okay? And then we're gonna kind of complicate it up in a minute, all right? All right, so there we go. That's the dollar amount that each one is putting in. All right, everybody cool? Okay, so let's kind of skip down just a little bit. So in our little project here, the actual project on an annual basis is generating net operating income of $60,000. Now that $60,000 is totally divorced, totally separate from all of this over here, because this is what the project is generating, you know, in terms of just revenue, okay? But now out of that $60,000, we know that we've got to pay our debt service, and in this case, we're keeping it simple, we're making it an interest-only loan, all right? So what we would do is we'd say, okay, we have $800,000 in debt, okay? So $800,000 times, what's our interest rate on our debt?
5%.
5%. There's your 40,000. Okay? Now if you pull up the spreadsheet, you would see it's coded that way, so it's gonna have done that calculation for you. So that leaves you now with before tax cash flow of 20,000. Okay? Everybody good? All right. Now, this is another new concept. Pari passu distribution. Okay? How many of you have ever heard that term, pari passu? Okay? Good. All right. So, pari passu pretty much means what you put in, you get out. Okay? And it's proportional. Okay? So, if you were putting in, you know, 70% of the in, or if you're providing 70% of the equity, you should be getting out 70% of returns. Okay? So, it's just a proportional. So, somebody had a question, sorry. No? Okay. All right. So in this case, the pari passu distribution of this before tax cash flow of 20,000, what we're saying is the developer partner, they put in $30,000 or what percent? 15%. So let's go over here. If we take that 20,000 and we multiply it by 15%, what do we get? We get the $3,000. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes or no? Okay. And then for the investor, if we have the $20,000, they put in 85%, they would get 17,000. Okay? Again, pretty simple math so far. All right? Okay. Okay, so we got through all of that. Now, what we were going to talk about is the pari passu distribution of the sale proceeds. Okay? So, in this case, what we're saying is that the sale proceeds are going to be what? Well, let's go back up here for a second. We've got, it's going to sell for $100,000 more. Okay, so how are we getting, in essence, this dollar amount of 255,000 and the dollar amount of 45,000. That totals up how much?
That's
300,000.
300,000. This is to see if you were paying attention.
Minus the debt on the building is interest only.
Okay. You're subtracting out the debt. Okay, think about it like this. Let me erase some of this over here.
sécurisation of debt and down payment and equity.
Okay. We are selling the property for 1.1 million. Yes?
Yes.
Okay? But of that dollar amount that we're selling it for, we're not just paying ourselves back we're not just taking the capital gain of the $100,000, we're also having to pay ourselves back for the original equity that we put into the project. So in other words, what we're really doing is we're saying, all right, we put in a total, well, actually let's do it this way. If we were to just subtract out the amount that we borrowed, okay, everything else that's left over is what we get to keep, yes?
Yes.
On a before tax basis. So that's going to give us
300,000.
$300,000. Okay, so we bought it for $1 million, we're selling it for 1.1 million, but so it's only $100,000 quote unquote profit, but we've also got to pay ourselves back the original 200,000 that we put in as equity.
Yes.
Okay, does that make sense? Yep.
So you don't subtract out like 40,000 times 5? Or is that what you're saying?
We're getting there.
If like interest for the 5 years, like is that not?
We're getting there. Okay, so right now, this is simply the total dollar amount that we would have available to us on a before tax basis to split up at the time of sale. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, so of that 300,000, we once again simply say the developer is going to get 15% of that. What does that end up being? So 45,000 is going to go to the developer. Okay, well, what number do we have up here? 45,000. Okay. Taking that 300,000, multiplying by 85% for the investor, they're going to have 255,000. Okay? That number there. Okay? Is everybody still with me? Okay. Now, so starting with those fundamental pieces of information, then we go and we start kind of filling in the cash flow. All right? So let's start over here on the far right because it's sometimes a little bit easier to do that. All right, on the far right, what does this 200,000 represent? That's the total equity that we put into the project, the 200,000 that we put into the project, yes?
Yes.
Okay. And then each year, we get $20,000 a year in terms of the leftover cash flow, the before tax cash flow, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Then in the final year, when we sell it, we get $20,000 still, but we also get the 300,000 on the reversion. Okay, is everybody cool? I know I'm going through this really, really slow, but I want to make sure that you got it. Sure, it's my hand. Okay, all right. So once you've got that column, and does that column make sense to everybody? Where the numbers are coming from? Okay. Then you would simply put this column in on your as a cash flow problem using one payment per year. Boom, 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 boom. Solve for internal rate of return, you get 17.11%. Okay? Everybody good?
Yes.
All right. Now, let's go over to the developer. everybody understand where these cash flows are coming from. Okay? So the 30,000 is simply their proportional piece of the original equity, their proportional piece of the annual cash flows, and then their proportional piece of that final year's cash flow plus the return of the down payment plus the increase in the sale value. Okay? Now, you do the calculations on that, you're also going to get 17.11 because it's all proportional. Okay? In other words, both sides, in terms of the investor as well as the developer, they're getting the same thing. Okay? Pari passu. Everybody kosher with that. And then the same thing with the investors column, you know, same process. All right, so if it's pari passu, just making sure this is clear in your head. If it's pari passu, all three of those numbers are going to be the same. If they're not, you did something wrong. Okay? All right, now, it's kind of...
It's because it's an interest-only loan, that's why I've been
Right.
thinking about
The reason I did it as an interest-only loan purposely was to simplify it.
Yeah, so you don't, so the amount of money that you paid at the beginning is the same amount in the
Right.
debt you owe at the end.
Right.
To simplify.
Right.
Okay.
Now, in reality, that's not usually going to be the case. In reality, yeah, you're going to have obviously like we did last week when we talked about equity buildup. You know, you're going to have a certain, you know, dollar amount that every year you hold that loan, you're going to be paying down. That obviously you're going to have to adjust. But I chose not to incorporate that into this model because I want to make sure you understand the model. You know, before we try to complicate it.
But this spreadsheet can account for that.
If we play around with it a little bit, okay? Which is probably what you're going to have to do for your final project, okay? All right, now, okay, we skip on down, okay? And you look at the bottom half of your spreadsheet, okay, or bottom third, okay? And you're going to see the numbers, everything matches, okay? Still the same thing. But we've added a new line here to allow for something a little special. And that is to give what is called a preferred return to your investor partner. Okay? So let's just see how this might work. So let's just say that we want to give them a preferred return of 10%. Okay? So see what happens here. Take a look at what's jumping. Okay, first of all, you can see that the overall, basically, before tax internal rate of return, jumps up a little bit for them, goes way down for you as the developer, because you're not getting that special sort of 10% rate of return. Let's just kind of, so is everything changing? Let's just sort of see, okay? Go back to 0 here for a second. You know, so we've still,
Reversion wouldn't change,
Well-
you're positive.
so the reversion in the sense of, well, we're gonna get to that. Okay, I don't want to confuse things. Okay. So if you scroll down just a little bit more, you see that the reversion is not changing, okay? All that we are changing is the return that we are going to give to the investor, okay? And so what we're doing, let's just sort of see if we can kind of figure out how to get that number, all right? In terms of if we're adding in 10%, if we go back to 0, we see it's 17,000. So at a base, sorry, go ahead.
So is the pref just just trying to get the investor to come into the deal more?
Yeah, part of the whole idea is that you can possibly get them to be a bit more engaged in the process. Yeah, and give them what's called this whole idea of a promote, which is, in essence, you're asking them, in essence, to promote the project.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, so in addition to having the money in the game, they may have some incentive to market the project, you know, or to be more actively involved in the actual operation of the project in some way.
Is it like a waterfall?
To a certain extent, yeah. But, okay, let me just kind of explain how we get there. And hopefully this will become a little bit more clear. All right. So what we're doing is we're giving them 10% of a preferred return. Now, let me just kind of back up here in a second. Let's make this 0 here, and then put in 10% here. Okay? So this 10%, it's based on the amount that they have invested. Okay? How much did they invest?
170.
Well, in this case,
Of the 200,000, 170,000.
170.
we're saying they invested 170, so a 10% return on 170,000 would be
17,000.
17,000. Okay? So what's happening, if we kind of go back now, let's say we put it at 100%, all right? So now, in this case, let's say that the developer, in one sense, gets nothing, okay? Which obviously would make no sense whatsoever for the developer to put in 30,000 only to get back their 30,000 at the end. But if that were indeed the case, then once again, what's really happening here with the investor is they're putting in their 170, they're getting the entire 20,000 the whole way through, and then they're getting their portion of the reversion, so they would end up making 19.71%. Okay? All right. Now, what we have done up here, kind of look at the language, leftover distribution to the investor, okay? So this is a little bit, this is basically what we're doing now. If we have it set as 85%, then that means that once they get paid their 85%, then the remainder goes to the developer. Okay? The reason it's called a preference is this. Remember what I'm talking about? Not only who gets paid, but when they get paid. Okay? In what order do they get paid? Okay? So what's happening here with that pref return is the first dollar amount that gets paid is that original 17,000. Okay? Off of, kind of go back here just for a second.
Everything's before taxes.
Let's do it this way. Okay, so giving the investor nothing in terms of a normal return while they're going through the project, only giving them the pref return, and they get nothing on the leftovers. All the leftovers go to the developer. Under that scenario, they're simply getting a fixed 10% rate of return. Does that make sense? Because the rate of return they're getting is just the 10% on the amount that they originally invested. Anything above and beyond that 10% rate of return, 100% is going to the developer. Okay? Does that make sense?
Does that happen? That happens, right?
What?
That happens, right?
Absolutely. I don't know how many times I can say this. It's infinite in terms of how many structures that you can come up with to satisfy this. Okay? And this is the simplest of them all. Okay? In terms of setting it up. And it all gets down to what are you trying to, in essence, compensate one party for? What are you trying to compensate the other party for? What is fair compensation between them? What can they come to an agreement on? Because what you may find is that you may have the money investor, strangely enough, may be a very unsophisticated player. They are simply looking for a fixed rate of return of whatever they want as a fixed rate of return. In other words, they're making a choice. I'm going to put my money in certificates of deposit earning 2 or 3 or 4%, or I'm going to invest in real estate and you can give me 7% or 10%. Okay? And that may be the level of sophistication of that person. Okay? But then you may also have that same sort of money player that is extremely sophisticated and says, hey, no, I want, to be paid first off before anybody else, and I want this fixed rate of return, then I want a certain percentage of the proceeds at the end, and so forth, so on, and even more complex than that, okay? This just scratches the surface of the complexity.
In that case, the order where the distribution comes from is very important then.
Yes. Because there has to be money left over. I mean, this model pretty much sets it up that, now if we go and we were to put in, let's say, 15%, now we're going to the negative. We're saying that if the investor was demanding a 15% pref return, okay, well, we would pay them, but the problem is that would have to come out of our pocket as the developer. Okay? Under this model.
So that 15% is affecting the cash flow up at the top.
It's affecting what dollar amount gets paid out by, in other words, here's the thing. The deal structure, all of this over here, is independent of what the actual project is doing. The project is still yielding a $20,000 a year cash flow.
Right, I meant like affecting the cash flow where the developer would be getting.
Yes,
And then the reversion stays the same though.
right,
Because they're getting their money back out
right.
with the cash.
So I have a question regarding the preferred rate of return is just basically the yield. Someone says, here's $200,000, give me 10%. I want 10% for a 5-year holding period. That's it. The leftover distribution to investor and developer, can you explain that aspect?
That is simply all remaining cash flows, including the reversion, would go to whoever you
Whoever
designate.
is, okay.
And so what I was saying here, let's just make this 0 for a second.
Yeah.
And then we make this 0, okay? So this basically is saying, now the developer receives everything. And so if the developer received everything, that means they're putting in 30 grand, they're getting 100% of the operating cash flows, and they're getting everything above and beyond what the investor put in on the reversion.
Okay.
So that would be the most that the developer could earn on this deal, okay?
So then,
But that would be totally
Crazy, I get it.
crazy,
so the
okay?
preferred return to investor partner really affects the cash flow that the developer is receiving.
Yes.
And then the leftover distribution percentages affects the reversion at the end that both parties would be receiving.
So, once again, we kind of go back here, that we could actually, let's just kind of max it out. So even with having to go in the hole each year, okay?
Right, you make out.
We're
because
still
you're
gonna do
getting-
fine because we're getting a disproportional, we're getting all of the reversion.
Right, but for simplistic math, when you're calculating it, really, if you look at the percentage of whatever you give us for leftover distribution to investor, that's gonna affect reversion at the end, and then the top number is
Yes.
really affecting cash flow.
Correct.
Okay,
Under this model,
right, it's for simple
yes,
terms.
yep.
But that 23, I'm sorry, that 23.49% is not the percentage of the project, that's the percentage of your investment, right?
That, in other words, if you were to invest, have invested 30,000 and then an additional $5,000, $500 each year, and then did the internal rate of return calculation, you would have gotten a 23% rate of
Return on
return.
your investment.
Right,
Can we just spreadsheet on the quiz?
That makes sense?
no. That's what I'm saying, that's what I'm saying, you have to do it by hand.
That's what I just said, guys.
That's what I'm saying, you need to be following this because you're gonna have to do it by hand, okay? All right.
It's so, it's simple as that.
Okay, so let's put this back. All right. So as long as you keep the leftover distributions proportionate to what they actually put into the project, these numbers down here are gonna be the same as they are above, okay? But it's only whenever you begin to change. So now let's just talk about kind of the reason, okay? We've done the math, let's talk about the rationales behind this. All right? So, I'm the developer. What am I gonna have to do to convince my investor partner to basically maybe give me a larger percentage of the distribution of the cash flows.
Tell them you're gonna shop the deal around to other investors.
Okay? That I'm gonna try to maximize the value, but I'm also, okay, I'm gonna maybe shop the deal around. What else?
As a, you're talking about from the perspective of the investor?
In other words, yes, from the perspective of the investor, what is it that I can say as a developer to move them to allow me to, let's say, take a greater percentage, like maybe, let's just do 50-50. That's a nice, easy one.
You're gonna larger percent of the,
Even if you put your money in the bank, you're not gonna make as much money as you are right now with the internal rate of return I'm offering
What
you.
we're saying is, I mean, look at it like this. If we did it's a simple 50-50 split on the cash flows, okay, that still gives the investor, you know, a nice rate of return of 10.6% for doing nothing. Okay? Just simply giving us the money to do the deal. That's still twice the rate of return that the lender is getting, because the lender's only getting a 5% interest rate.
Yeah.
Okay? So, in other words, what you're really looking at this other investor is there's just another source of capital.
Just like a bank.
Just like a bank. Okay? So, their rate of return may not be that high. Okay? It may just be, once again, they just want, I mean, think about it like this. Let's say that you've had a career in professional sports for the past 15, 20 years. You've retired. You've got a big wad of cash sitting in your bank account that you haven't spent, and you're just simply looking for a place to park that money for 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be. You know, you find someone who has a fairly decent reputation to invest with, and then somebody say to them, look guys, I'm getting 3 or 4% by putting this into a bank and certificates of deposit. If you can give me twice that, I'll be thrilled.
That's not the
Okay?
annual percentage rate, right? That's over the 5
This
years.
would be annualized,
Annualized.
10.6 annualized.
Okay, so, like, if we don't have this and we're going to do this by hand, the first thing we should do is set up the right-hand column with the total
Yes,
project.
yes.
And then when you find the leftover distribution, like say it is zeroed out for the preferred return, then the cash flows on the right side of the total project. You just split that half and half, so it's 10,000 and 10,000. But how come you're not splitting like the reversion? Like, shouldn't the reversion be like?
The reversion, we're simply keeping that in essence as pari passu.
it's the percentage.
Because that is going to be,
So how can you have, like, isn't that right there basically like contradicting the pari passu? Like, it's almost like an amendment to the agreement? Like, how can you say pari passu and then say, oh, but we're going to split it up this way, then that's not pari passu?
because this is not pari passu.
Yeah, no, exactly, so how
No,
can?
no, I mean, it's not, in terms of the whole thing is not pari passu. Portions of it are.
Okay.
But this is what I'm saying, that based upon the model that you created here, it can allow for it to be pari passu, or you can modify it to where it's not.
So the year 5 cash flow, under the assumption that it's like 0% preferred, 50-50 distribution, would be the 10,000, 10,000 each, but then the reversion would still be pari passu added on to that 50-50 cash flow difference.
Right.
And then if it was a preferred rate of return, and say it was 20% or anything, you would just do that 20% times the cash flow in the total project, and then that would get added to the investor's portion, and then
Correct.
whatever left over.
Correct. But the thing you start with, the key, is you start with the preferred return. Okay? Because if you start with the preferred return, then that's with this 10%, let's say, we know that they have invested $170,000. That's their equity. So they're going to get 10% of whatever that equity is. Okay? So let's just play around with that number just a little bit. Let's say it's 5%. Okay? Then they're only going to get 5% of 170. But that's the first step that you would need to take. Okay? Then once you have calculated that, to know that they're getting 8,500 of
The 20,000.
of the 20,000, then whatever is left over is going to be dictated by
The percentage.
the percentage.
Okay.
That's the order of operation. That's why it's called a preferred return. because that's what's getting paid first. That's the peak of the waterfall, if you will.
And that leftover on this is the distribution of sales proceeds, is that right?
Well,
It's both.
this is, well, down here is just something showing, okay, what they're getting on the reversion as a result. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I mean, it says that, you know, the tariff pursue, distribution of before tax cash flow is the 3 and the 17,
Right.
right? But, what would be considered leftover would be whenever you go below and you do the percentages. That's,
Right.
isn't that the distribution of sales proceedings?
Well, it might be 50. If it makes it.
So what's left over is
Of the amount after you have subtracted out
Okay.
the preferred return, whatever amount is left over. So in other words, you're gonna take 20,000 minus whatever dollar amount is paid out in preferred return. That is the amount that then will be split up.
Right. So you've obligated yourself to pay 5 or 10% as a preferred, and once that's paid, everything else is.
Correct. Is split up, in this case, 50-50. Okay? So, and as I said, I swear on a stack of Bibles, I am not being facetious or not trying to be overly whatever. This is the simplest
Version.
Oh, I can see that.
of a traditional kind of payout for partner distributions.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in many cases, it gets, you know, very granular in the sense of, you know, they may say, okay, we're not gonna take any money until the property is stabilized, okay? Well, then how do you define stabilization? Once it's maybe achieved 85% occupancy, okay? Once it's achieved 85% occupancy, then we're now gonna start the distributions. And at the beginning of the project, maybe we're gonna give the majority of that to the developer as a bonus for getting everything done correctly and appropriately. Then, after so many years of operation, we may adjust that, you know, downward to sort of reflect that the investor is going to get a certain, you know, percentage, and then ultimately on the sale, you know, then that's going to be dictated by maybe a value estimate, whether we sell it or not. I mean, you know, that's just the beginning of the complexity, because you can have, in this case, we've got two parties. We've got the developer, we've got the investor. In a lot of these deals, you can very easily have 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 different players, all of which are getting something different. Because this person invested first, so we're going to give them a better return than the person that invested last. You know, so, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Everything gets more complex from here. The purpose of this is just simply to bring to your attention an awareness of how a deal structure and what a deal structure is. Okay? Okay. Any questions? Yep.
Yeah, so say you have 95% of the project and your partner has 5%. It's not really a math question, but you have 95% and you want to sell the property, but your 5% partner doesn't want to sell. Like, is there a way to force the sale?
You're saying, okay, like this, that you basically, you've got 5%, the investor partner has 95%, and you're, who's wanting to force the sale? The developer?
The 95% partner.
They're wanting to force the sale of the property. If, in the partnership agreement, it's spelled out, there has to be mutual consent, you know, between the partners, even though they differ in the amounts that they put in. You know, it could very well be set up to where they're on equal footing, or potentially the developer ultimately does decide the optimal time to sell. Because if you're making the assumption that the developer is the one with the market knowledge, with the understanding, then you potentially would want to put the power of the timing of the sale in their hands, and they would also probably want the power of timing because they want to maximize what their maybe rate of return is. I'm not saying it's always going to work out that way, you know, but I'm just saying, yes, theoretically, sure, it's possible. I mean, chances are, you're probably not going to want to do that. But, I mean, I think market timing sorts of things, I mean, what I have seen as a matter of practice in most instances is you have a set period of time, usually 5 years, and at the end of that 5 years, you simply say, okay, we're gonna have the property valued by 3 different appraisers. We're gonna take basically an average of those 3 values, and then at that point, if either party wants to sell out, the other party has the option to buy them out at a predetermined amount and walk away from the deal, or they can stay in the deal, you know, maybe get another partner, whatever, you know, might be the case. Okay, good questions. All right, other questions? Yep.
I just wanna make sure, cause I'm explaining this, I wanna make sure I'm explaining it correctly. Basically, when you go down to the preferred return to the investor, what that is that's a percentage that is taken out of the overall cash flows initially before any type of divide is done, if there is a divide between the investor and the developer. And so, and then that divide would be what the leftover distribution percentage is. You get it now? Okay. All right.
And then once again, that's why it's all preferred, it gets paid first.
Okay. So on the top. So on
Okay.
the top, do that.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, let me see what else.
Yeah, the total project. And then you can work it backwards out of that.
Thanks.
Mr. President?
Yep,
So basically, if we were gonna do the preferred return to investor, first, we basically get that percentage off the total project, and whatever's left over gets distributed amongst the developer investor, right?
that is correct,
Based on their percentage.
correct. Well, based upon what the payoff percentage is of the distribution, leftover distribution. Yeah,
Ah, got
okay.
So, we change that 5 to 10, let's roll it. The 10%. Okay, so, in the reversion, you take out each one of the portions, the total project equity, and then the remainder from that is how that percentage affects the reversion.
Once again, all you're doing in this scenario, once again, ignore this, start with this, start with the 10% or start with whatever the preferred return is. Identify what is the investor's dollar amount equity. Whatever that dollar amount equity is, multiply that by whatever the preferred return is, that is what they're going to receive as a base amount. Okay, so in this case, 170,000 times 10% is 17,000. So they're going to receive that as a base. That means you have $3,000 left over. Of that $3,000 is left over, that's getting split 50-50. So they get 1,500 and you get an additional 1,500, meaning 17,000 plus 1,500.
Now, the reversion though, that means that they're splitting the remainder reversion, which is 100,000 by 50-50.
Correct.
50,000.
Correct. Correct.
I call
Correct. Not the original equity,
it. Right.
but the remainder, reversion. The $100,000 gets split proportionally, based upon,
Their
Right.
positions.
in this model.
I follow.
Okay.
Remind me where that 100,000 from the reversion came from?
Okay. The 100, okay, the project was bought for a million, it's selling for 1.1 million, so that's a $100,000 difference.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. Gotcha.
Okay, Chase? I'll let you get a hand up. Okay, anybody else? Well, that's kind of what this is. So, okay, all right, ignore, what do we do this? All right.
That makes sense, but when I think.
Okay, I'll give you some of the starting numbers, let's,
Doesn't make sense.
Like you lost your screen.
I know, on purpose, because I don't have it, she said you want a practice problem, so we're gonna give you a practice problem.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So, let's see.
I see it there, I don't see it where
He's gonna give us a price.
You see what I mean? So this makes sense to me. Or is it based? There's nothing. No, but you're still not getting everything. My question.
Okay. So I've created a practice problem. Now what you're going to do is put it in, here's your worksheet, all right? So, all right, so I'm going to give you the key variables. All right, starting at the top. Project purchase price. Write it in on this sheet. It's a two-sided sheet, write it on one side of it. Okay? Project, this is a practice problem, just to see if you can actually do it. Okay? All right. Purchase price, $500,000. Sale price, $750,000. Loan to value, 75%. Interest rate on the debt, 10%. Developer partner equity, we're skipping over the equity percent, you're going to calculate it. Developer partner equity, 20%. Project annual NOI, $50,000. And that's it.
What was the sales price?
Interest only, $750,000. Everything. Everything else is left over. If you need me to repeat anything, I will.
What was the partnership? Percentage?
Okay, once again, going to the top of the deal structure spreadsheet. Project purchase price, $500,000. Project sale price at the end of year 5, $750,000. Loan to value ratio, 75%. Interest rate on the debt, 10%. Developer partner equity percent, 20%. Project annual NOI, $50,000. And everything else, you have to calculate.
there's no concept of preferred return on this.
Well, this one. Okay, you done?
Cause I'm lying down to my IRR, like, relax, Joe. Hasn't finished it. Joe?
You didn't get
We're getting there.
Sorry.
Okay, let's go ahead and work through this piece of it. All right, so these are the inputs that I gave you, all right, in yellow. All right, so the other ones you had to figure out. So obviously the equity percent would have been the first thing you had to figure out, 25%. If you're putting in 75% debt, 25% is going to be what your equity would be, all right? And then for the investor partner equity, since the developer partner is putting in 20%, you're putting in, or the investor's putting in 80%. Okay, hopefully everybody got those two calculations right.
Yes.
Okay, then we come down to the project annual NOI. That was given to you at 57,000. Then you had to calculate the project annual debt service, which should be basically taking the loan-to-value ratio of 75% times the purchase price of 500,000, which would be $375,000 would be the loan amount, times 10%, so 37,500 would be your debt service, okay? So that's the first calculation that required a little bit of thought, okay? Hopefully everybody got that one. Then the before tax cash flow is simply subtracting that from the annual NOI. Okay, all right, now, okay? So the dollar amount of the pari passu distribution of the before tax cash flow, 12,500 would be going to the developer, 10,000 to the investor partner. Hopefully everybody got that right. Okay.
2,000.
Okay. Then the pari passu distribution on the sale proceeds, a total of 375,000 in terms of all of the sale proceeds, including the original sort of equity. So 375,000 total, 75,000 going to the developer partner, 300,000 going to the investor. Okay. And then now for the final piece that I asked you to do. All right. So you should have gotten 31.49 as the internal rate of return for all three, and then the developer's cash flows as follows: investor and total project. Okay. Now, if you screwed up, what did you screw up on?
I was just wondering, I rounded up with that, I rounded it up to 31.5, was that penalized?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I rounded it up to 31.5, was that penalized?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, how did you get the 300,000 again, please? I know it's the difference between the sale price and the purchase price plus something else, right?
Okay. So in this particular case, let's go back to the top. Okay,
That's 250 right there.
so in this particular case, all right, it sells for 750.
Bless you.
Okay, our loan amount on this one was what?
It is
80%, 75% of 500,000, so 375.
275.
Okay, so our loan, 375,000, that's our debt. What?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. So 750,000 minus 375,000 gives us a $375,000 basically reversion. Of that 375,000, just happens to be half of it. Okay, in this case, then we would say for the developer partner, their percentage was what?
20%.
20%. So that means they would get 75,000, and then so the remainder, 80% of 300,000 would go to the investor.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay? Yes,
Total project for the, year zero?
I'm sorry,
Year zero total project.
okay.
Wait, give me a second, I'm trying to figure this out myself.
So for year, or time period zero, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, the project cost was 500,000, yes? Okay? Their equity in the deal was what? The equity was 25% equity. So 125,000 total equity, this column here, and then the remainder then split between the two appropriately. Okay? Okay? Everybody good? Okay, now, to the bottom half. Okay. So, all right, so the bottom half, you write this maybe on another piece of paper. Don't use the other side because we want to keep the other side available for the test, all right, for the quiz. All right, so this bottom half, let's see if we can make this one work. So this I didn't give you yet, but the preferred return to the investor partner, 12%, leftover distribution, 60% to the investor, 40% to the developer. All right, and I've given you line 0, which you already should basically have. So all you really have to figure out here is just what the, first of all, what did I say the order of operations was?
First.
Preferred, okay, start with that. Okay, so let's just kind of work through this together. If the investor has put in 100,000, still wet. So if the investor has put in 100,000 and their preferred return is 12%,
12,000.
that means they're going to get
12,000.
12,000 as a base, okay, for each and every year, okay? Now, what is the total amount that we have to be able to give away each year?
12,500.
12,500, all right? So if we've got 12,500 to give away, and we're giving away 12,000, then that means we have $500 each year to distribute. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. And then out of that, you gotta divide it up with 60/40.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so how much is going to the investor?
60%.
Okay, to the investor, 60, they're getting 60%. Okay,
300.
so $300. So the investor is going to get 12,300, whereas the developer is going to get them the remaining. The developer would get 40%, or the remaining 200. Okay, so let's just see, and hope that that is how it turned out. And it did, amazing. Okay. So, for the first 4 years, that's a series of cash flows. Okay, is everybody okay with that? Okay. Now then the final year, okay, let's see what they're getting. All right. So the whole project, in terms of the reversion for the project, we said was 375,000. Yes? At the end. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. And we're disproportionately giving part of that to the investor and to the developer. But what we've got to do first is we've got to subtract out what?
What they put in.
The initial equity that they each put in. So the investor put in 100,000, yes? And the developer put in 25,000. Okay, so let's just see what we have left over. So 375,000 minus 100,000 minus 25,000 would give us 250,000 to then distribute proportionally. Does that make sense? Okay, so they're going to get their 100,000 automatically, or 100,000 here, 25,000 here, but then proportionally, the investor is going to get 60% of this, which is 150,000. That goes to the investor, all right? So the investor is going to get 150,000 plus their original investment of 100,000 for a total of 250,000 plus the cash flow of 12,300, giving them the total of 262. Where it was 300? Yeah. Okay. So that's the investor. Yep.
So in the last problem, when we came to the reversion, we did the per pursuit, yeah?
In one of the examples, yes.
So in this example, when I get down to the year 5 reversion, shouldn't it still be the 20%, 80% on the
No,
sale price?
because this is all about what's left over after the fact.
But I'm like in one example, it was the same exact problem, and one
Because when we changed whether it was gonna, in other words, when we change those percentages, everything changes.
No, I know.
In one example, it was para pursuit, but this one is not para
So how
pursuit.
do we know that? Like what changed in the example?
You're gonna look at the calculations.
Well, I know, but how come I couldn't have done these calculations in the last problem? And
You
it,
could have.
Year zero.
Even if it was para pursuit, the calculation's the same.
no, it's not.
Yeah,
Compare
no,
pursuit,
no,
everything is 60.
No, it's the same in the sense of the process is the same. You still go through the same process of the calculations, it's just you're gonna apply different percentages.
Yeah, but how do I know which percentage to apply? Because I just did this and worked ahead.
All right, look, okay.
If a preferred return is present, then you take into account the splits. If no preferred return is there, then you know it's pari passu.
But like, I get that.
Okay, let me make sure that I'm trying to be, I really am trying to be as clear as I can possibly be, okay? So, in this case, regardless of whether it's pari passu, okay, everybody listen, regardless of whether it's pari passu, regardless of what the distributions are, what is not going to change is what the overall project will yield. Okay, that column will be the same regardless. Okay, what will change is, and also what will not change is the dollar amounts put in up front proportionally to what the original contributions were. Those will not change. So the first point of change, departure from normal, is we have to look at the preferred return, and in this case, that being something other than zero, we now have to take that into account. If it's, in this case, 12%, that's where we've got to come over here and we've got to say, all right, what dollar amount is that, in essence, being based off of? So, you know, in this particular case, for the investor, they have put in 100,000% equity. Their preferred return is 12%. That means right off the bat, before anybody else gets paid, before anything else is done, they must receive that $12,000 out of the project, okay? Then, the next piece is to say, okay, the project is yielding 12,500, a third column. The project is yielding 12,500 each year. You've got to subtract out their preferred return, which leaves you with $500 of cash flow to now distribute in whatever way, whether it's pari passu or whether it is in some other percentage, okay? So in this particular case, the $500, 60% of it is going to go to the investor partner. The remaining 40% is going to go over to the developer, okay? Which we haven't done the full set of calculations for the developer. So for the investor, this is what we have. So now for the developer, in their case, what they're getting is 40%. The developer is getting 40%. Times 0.4. So the developer is going to get 100,000. This is the developer. Plus, they're going to get back, in this case, their original 25,000. Okay. And then that's going to give us 125,000. All right. Then they're going to get the 200 off of the remainder. So now 125,200 is going to be the reversion for the development. Okay. Yes.
Okay, so when you did it earlier, confused me, and now it's confusing me again. I get all that. When I change that preferred return investor partner number to 20%, then that math doesn't work. Why is that? At that point, if he's wanting 20%, that's 20 grand off the top. So then you have a negative number. That, I can't do that over there. It's not, so, okay, so we get 100 grand
Yep.
times 20%, that's $20,000. 20,000 minus the 12,500 that we're physically getting is 7,500. That's left over. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Okay,
Because that's what's really confusing us.
okay. So you're saying if we did that, what's confusing you is, all right,
So out of the debt from the top, right, because you said we would calculate.
we were talking about the reversion, or are we talking about that cash flow?
The cash flow, so we have the 100 grand, right?
Yep.
Times 20%, that's 20,000 that's going to the developer off the top,
So why is it?
based on that explanation, am I correct?
The investor gets off the top, not the investor, not the developer, right?
And there's really no money in the project.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's gonna work with a number that's gonna be greater than
Okay.
what the actual. Oh, it was.
No, I know, it's.
She was asking what if it were 20?
Originally, when we did the other problem, I got confused because I was doing the math as you're explaining it in paper, but it wasn't making sense when I was.
Okay.
So then, are we gonna get in the test a number that's greater, or is it gonna be a number that's less?
We'll adjust it if we need to.
Okay.
It should be fine. Okay. All right. So with what we have discussed so far, are we clear? That's what matters. Okay. Now, let me see if there's any other.
I do have a question.
Okay.
On the pair pursuit at the top, so I understand that we have preferred equity present, or preferred return present. We then calculate the leftover distributions on the reversion. As in, you take in both the developer and the investor's proportionate equity away from the total reversion. But when it's pari passu, you don't have to do that, because then you're just multiplying by their initial equity position.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
Just the 100,000 that goes to the developer, how are you getting that number again, just real fast? That's in the reversion. How is he getting 100,000? That comes from, that's his 40% of the 375?
40% of the 250. So the 250 is coming from the 375 minus the investor's piece, minus the developer's piece, 250 to distribute.
And that investor's piece is his preferred return? No, that's his input, right?
One more time, what was the question?
The developer's piece, 100,000, that's his contribution at the beginning of the project, the 100,000.
No. His original contribution was 25,000.
Now that's the developer's contribution.
The developer's contribution was 25,000, the investor's contribution was 100,000. So you can kind of begin to see why I don't have multiple investors and multiple partners in the example, because, you know, this is this complicated with just basically two. It's very messy very quickly.
All right. All spreadsheets are easy.
So just to clarify one last time, so on like this paper,
Yep.
like the one we already have.
Yep.
So the developer investor partner equity is the 1518, that is the leftover.
Because that one's fair pursuit.
Okay, so if there is a preferred return to investor,
Then it's no longer.
then when I go to do the reversion, I'm just gonna follow that leftover and preferred and order.
Just like we did here, yes.
you have to take a portion of equity position of both away from the net version. If
You give us
Okay. I'm going to throw you a little bit of a monkey wrench in there just to see if you can kind of tinker with it a little bit. But for the most part, yeah, you should be good to go. Okay. All right. So with that, if you want to, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and I'll let you do both quizzes simultaneously.
Just a little bit after you see it left to right, it makes sense.
But the quizzes are open notes, just not open computer.
I thought we were going to have our spreadsheet class all over.
I just wrote it down.
He understands it, but I'm overwhelmed.
Yes, you're doing the investor So 17,000. Yeah.
Not that 30,000 gets less than 85%. Just left over.
So you have to have this to follow.
Yeah.
17,000 for tax cash.
Okay, gotcha.
So you have to have this too. Sure.
No, we never saw, when I saw you change the negative, I was like,
You're welcome.
that's
Going all the way.
You're welcome. Maybe we can fix that.
Yeah, I know, I just thought it the other way.
This is the one we just did, right? I understand. This is the one we just did.
Yeah. It's like,
Oh, congratulations, how was your closing? You had a closing last
Friday.
Oh.
I'm scrambling in a mover for Wednesday. I have to throw everything in storage.
if there's not an exception.
Hold on.
it's up.